You may have heard that Masters of the Universe Revolution is an improvement over the previous season Revelation, and the good news is that it is. But make no mistake about it though, the bad news is that this is still written by activists who would also appear to be basement dwellers with no life experience and no knowledge of either history or the human condition. To begin with the positive, they actually did take a lot of feedback from the fan backlash towards the first season on board. Teela, no longer voiced by Sarah Michelle Gellar, is no longer an entitled mean bitch. She is also magically no longer a lesbian, and we're all supposed to pretend that her romance with Andra never happened. Also, it would appear that Teela, Andra and Evelyn collectively decided to lay off of the testosterone injections, because none of them look quite as much as dudes like they did before. Moving on to the dudes, He-Man makes up for being killed off in the previous season by being killed off exactly 0 times this season, so that's good. And finally, after long last, we got, if nothing else, a version of the story I've been wanting since our very first He-Man video 6 years ago. Skeletor might have started out as a demon from another dimension in his very first incarnation, but as the Masters of the Universe backstory evolved, so did that of Skeletor. The last batch of minicomics alluded to it, and both the Mike Young animated series and every later incarnation have been built around it. Skeletor is in fact Keldor, the bastard half-breed son of King Nero, and half-brother of King Randor. King Randor is of course Prince Adam's father. That's some great Shakespearean stuff right there, and any screenwriter worth their salt can develop that angle further. Too bad none of the screenwriters working on this were worth their salt, as we shall see. Because now that we've gone through the positive changes, let's go through how these inept writers, who evidently have no life experience to draw from, and who can't possibly know anything about either history, political science, or the human condition, proceeded to screw up in ever new ways. Going back to the first season, all the other problems kind of took a backseat to the cucking of Adam, but a big one for me was that heaven and hell weren't allegories or religious concepts, but physical realities, as in both heaven and hell, or Preternia and Subternia for locals, were physical locations you can travel to. That kind of takes the edge off of dying, when you know the afterlife is right there waiting for you, and that if in a pinch, anyone dead can in principle be brought back again. You just gotta open a portal to heaven or hell respectively and go collect them. I bring that up because this is literally what kicks off the story in Revolution. The Masters are going on a raid into hell to bring their people back, when King Randor, suffering from a condition the plot needs him to have in order to give Adam a moral dilemma, dies. But not before presenting Adam with that moral dilemma, of course, which is that when Randor dies, Adam will be king. But Adam can't be king and He-Man, the champion of Eternia, at the same time. So what is he to do? With reference to the video of yesterday, this is what executive producer and actual showrunner Ted Biaselli thought was so profound. What to do when your parents have one set of expectations for you, but you've got your own thing that you want to do instead. I can only imagine that Biaselli must have lived this, and mistaken his own trauma for something that everyone goes through, not realizing that his experiences are pretty much unique to him and him alone. More on that later. But for this series, this means that Adam now has an entirely made-up bullcrap dilemma on his hands. Will he be the champion He-Man, or will he be the king and serve his people, because he can't do both? This is honestly where things fall apart, because in actual reality there is no reason on God's green earth why he can't do both. That was just some shit that Biaselli made Randor pull out of his ass. I mean, some of the greatest kings in our actual history were warrior kings, champions of their people, sometimes conquerors, and kings. So that Adam suddenly can't be both is completely arbitrary and only there to instill some kind of faux dilemma in Adam. I mean, the solution is simply to surround himself with advisors who can manage the day-to-day operations while he makes the major strategic decisions. Or, put in Game of Thrones terms, appoint a Hand of the King, or even a Council of Hands of Kings. And then Adam can split his time between being King Adam and He-Man, the champion of the people. The showrunners were evidently blind to all of those solutions, but they did find a story reason to solve Adam's Thaw dilemma. That would be that Keldor, the aforementioned firstborn but bastard son of King Nero, banished in youth and assumed dead, suddenly shows up out of nowhere and demands to be made king. In other words, his claim to the throne is paper thin and would not hold up in any court. But since Adam is leaning towards being He-Man anyway, he sees handing the throne over to this dude claiming to be Keldor as the obvious course of action. And so, with no vetting process whatsoever, with no interview and no tests to check if this guy really is who he says he is, or if he has what it takes to be king, Adam just straight up hands the throne to his long-lost uncle Keldor, which turns out to be the technology-enhanced skeletor, now known as Skeletech, as he's been infected with Motherboard's Nanovirus, which we saw in the final moments of the previous season. That aside, this whole just handing off the throne plot only goes to show how clueless and how historyless these writers are. Yeah, a lot of bad stuff has happened in the history of monarchy, but not this. Wars have been fought over competing claims to the throne, most famously the War of the Roses, which inspired Game of Thrones. Bad kings tended to be deposed, and when someone either not yet of age or clearly not fit to rule nonetheless inherited the throne, then someone else would do the actual running of the realm instead, with varying degrees of success. Point is, for those of us with some knowledge of history, and I expect professional writers working on something related to that subject matter to be far more knowledgeable about it than me, this is pretty embarrassing, and it's gonna get worse. Meanwhile, going back to heaven and hell being real and physical quantities, Evil Lynn is trying to make amends for her part in the destruction of heaven in the previous season, and she does it for the least noble motivation I have ever heard. She doesn't want to go to hell, and she knows that's where she's headed unless she can fix the red in her book. And so, she's acting good here, but against her will and purely for self-serving purposes. Teela is also helping her out though, but her reason for doing so is that she wants to restore heaven so that good souls, most notably the recently passed Randor, has somewhere to go. But there is a more immediate threat to the still living, and that would be the aforementioned Motherboard, servant of Hordak. She released the Nanovirus that turned Skeletor into Skeletech, and this same Nanovirus will turn all the people of Eternia into soulless minions for Hordak, or basically Tech-Borgs. Luckily, the new King Keldor has the perfect solution for this, namely a vaccine. So, in no time flat, a vaccine program is rolled out, immunizing the population against the Nanovirus. But remember, the king is really working for the enemy, so it turns out this vaccine itself actually gave the populace the very nano-infection it was supposed to protect them from. I don't know where the writers get this from, so let's just move on. Either way, initially believing that Keldor was just some made-up fiction, Skeletech manages to break free from the mind virus, and learns that in reality, he had been Keldor all along. He had just been brainwashed to forget that and believe that he was a demon from another dimension. This presumably would be the dimension where he came from a world of Skeletors, and even had a Skeletor wife and a Skeletor daughter that were taken from him, Punisher style, as we saw in the prequel comics to this very series and which I covered in an earlier video. If anything, this retroactively fixes that, so kudos. But now, Skeletech is angry at Hordak, because Hordak keeps brushing him off, while elevating Motherboard over him. And so, Skeletech turns on them both, and this is where all storylines converge and all of Clownfish TV's recent leaks come true. Evil Lynn ends up redeeming herself and teams up with Zodak. Hordak ends up defeated, seemingly dead at the hands of Skeletor. Skeletor reverts back to Keldor and is locked up in Castle Grayskull. Teela, having given up on lesbianism, enters a relationship with He-Man, and He-Man moves in with her in Castle Grayskull, as he completely out of the blue and with no setup whatsoever decides to abolish monarchy altogether and hand the power to a confused people that has no infrastructure and no constitution from which to suddenly become a democracy. But Andra immediately decides that she's gonna run for president in this new world order, because it's about time Eternia had a female LGBTQIAP+ POC woman as a president, or something to that effect. What that all means though is that the once prosperous land of Eternia is going to go to hell in a handbasket. Not because of a presumed Andra presidency, mind you, but because the writers are historyless, witless, revolutionary activist tools that don't see any further than the generic slogan at the top of their minds. By that I mean, Eternia was by all accounts a prosperous nation, a well-oiled machine, where the people were well off, and from everything we can see, the royal family was popular and well-liked. Case in point, we never saw any kind of democracy movement, or any kind of popular demand for democracy whatsoever. If the writers had set up that the people were malcontent and wanted democracy to begin with, that would be one thing, but they didn't. Just like his father out of the blue and for no reason at all decided that Adam couldn't be king and He-Man at the same time, even though he totally could. Adam, out of the blue and for no reason at all, decided to abolish monarchy and thrust democracy upon a people who never asked for it. Do you know how well that has worked out in the recent history in our world? The writers evidently don't know, but it's not a great track record, let's put it that way. If anything, Adam could have started with making Eternia a constitutional monarchy where representatives elected by the people rule, while the role of the royal family is purely ceremonial. Case in point, my native Norway. The government, elected by the people, holds all political power, which means that at any given time, half the population hates the government, and they hate the other half of the population for voting in these corrupt WEF chills. But we're still one nation and one people, and one of the things that still unites and binds us together as such is our non-partisan king, who spent his entire life in service of his people and no one else. There's plenty horror stories with monarchy, in fact there may be more of them, but that's what a monarchy can be at its best. A national unifying symbol, binding the people of a nation together, where other forces would split them apart. Well, that is what Adam just robbed the people of Eternia of, a nationally unifying symbol, and the tradition and heritage that went with it. I wonder how unifying President Andra is going to be, or if maybe, just maybe, the people will vote in some dictator like Count Marceau, because historically, that's what happens whenever democracy is suddenly thrust upon a populace who never wanted nor asked for it, something the writers would have known if they weren't these historyless, unknowledgeable dolts. But to end on a positive note, this season did fix the biggest problems of the first season and left the slate in such a way that if you were to lock Ted Biaselli in a closet, fire Kevin Smith and all the other writers, every last one of them, and bring in good people instead, hell, bring back J. Michael Straczynski for instance, then there is now enough to work with here that just like Star Trek Picard after Terry Matalas came in and took over, Masters of the Universe Season 3 could be something truly special. If there is such a thing though. This season was pretty okay, but was it good enough to make up for Season 1? That I don't know. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments.